Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that very generous introduction. Might I join with you in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And it's a great delight to be with you here, you the folk of Kildare Ministries. I wasn't able to be here for your opening liturgy because I was attending the 90th birthday lunch of my mother. And we have 7 children in our family, one of whom lives in the United States, and all of us were able to be at lunch with Mum and Dad in Centennial Park, which was quite something. And wonderful day, and though it was a very comprehensive introduction, you weren't told the most critical details, and that is that in grade 1 and grade 2, I attended the Brigidine Holy Family School at Indooroopilly in Brisbane. And the 90-year-old Brennan, I think she was probably close to being the first president of the PNF of Our Lady of the Rosary Brigidine School at Kenmore. And I have very strong memories as a young boy there in the Kenmore parish. We had a colourful parish priest by the name of Tommy Carroll. I remember it used to be a little embarrassing for us as family because we would be sat in the front or second front row at Mass on a Sunday, and every now and again my father would be troubled by the theology of Tommy Carroll, and the family would be marched out of Mass. This culminated, we had a delightful parishioner by the name of Rick O'Sullivan. Now you may have heard of Rick O'Sullivan because he owned a racing horse called Think Big. Well, the first year that Think Big won the Melbourne Cup, it was tolerated that we were asked to pray for Think Big. But the second year it was coming up and Tommy was to travel with the O'Sullivans down to Melbourne, and once again he asked that we pray for Think Big during the prayers of the faithful. Well, that was altogether too much for my father, and we marched out. But I have wonderful memories. There was Mother de Montfort and Mother Lawrence, who used to drive in the Morris 1100 from Indooroopilly out to Kenmore every morning, and we would then throw rocks on the presbytery roof to wake up Tommy Carroll for morning mass, and then things would get underway. So with that background, it's delightful to be here. My teacher was actually Mother Matthew, who I have to confess was a bit of a tyrant. I don't know whether any of you knew her. But in grade 2, the class was mainly girls, but there were about 10 of us boys. And Mother Matthew, like I presume all Brigidines in those days, wore a number of hats. She was not only the grade 2 teacher, but she was in charge of the tuck shop. And so whenever the salesman came by to sell the licorice all sorts or whatever, she would have to go and to attend to the tuck shop, and she would appoint 2 of the girls as class prefects. And inevitably this meant that all of the boys were stood up behind columns and told to be on silence. And when she returned to class, the Brigidine sisters in those days, as I recall, used to wear a big black belt. And the black belt was removed and applied to the boys, and we were urged to be obedient. And if we were truly troublesome, we would be ordered to sit next to a girl. So you can imagine many years later, in 1985, when Mother Matthew attended my first Mass at Our Lady of the Rosary Church at Kenmore, I was very taken, very touched that she came. She was quite an age by then, but she presented me with a gift, and the gift was a large brown leather belt. I didn't have the heart to tell her what memories this would be. But I'm very indebted to the good sisters of St. Bridget for that early education. I've been asked to just open up the topic of being church in Australia today, a changing landscape, and it is indeed a changing landscape, as I think you would agree. All I can do is open up a few issues, but we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion, and you'll be aware there have been lots of things going on in recent days, and I've been more than usually in the media over the last 48 hours, so if there's any of that you want to discuss, I'm happy to do it, but it's not in the substance of the talk. So here we are contemplating signs of hope. So for you, what are they? Challenges? What are the things we're not doing? And where can we make a difference? And what are we being called to do? As you're probably aware, yesterday was the feast of Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, and his great gift, not only to the Jesuits but to the Church, is the gift of discernment, where it's usually not a matter of choosing between right and wrong, but a matter of choosing the marges. What is the greater good? What is it that I'm called to do that reflects God's greater glory? What is it that I'm called to do with a deep interior freedom, where the gifts that I have and that we have can best be marshalled to meet the greatest need in society? So, what are those challenges? What are the things we're not doing? Where can we make a difference? And what are we called to do? Well, as we contemplate this in our church at the moment, I think you'll agree that we as the Australian Church have to take as our starting point, emerging from what's been exposed in the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. I think the key to this is always putting a human face on what it is we're talking about. Here's one of the victims who appeared before the Royal Commission, and her name is Julie Stewart. I was very moved at the time by the opening statement that she made at the Royal Commission. She'd been abused as a child by a very troubled priest, Father Searson, who was the parish priest, when she was in the parish school at Doveton in Victoria. And this was the closing part of her opening statement. I still cry for the little girl I once was, the little girl that never got to be a normal little girl, doing all the things that little girls should do. The little girl who always just wanted to fit in, but always felt like a weirdo, like a problem. Nothing can ever give that back to me. It's a life sentence, and every day I make a choice to keep going. It's important to me to tell my story now because I want peace for myself. I want peace for Mr. Sleeman, the school principal, who fought to have the dreadful abuse of Father Searson dismissed. I've got kids and I want to be a voice. I want people to know that this happened. I'm not ashamed anymore, and I no longer blame myself. I will no longer be a victim. My name is Julie Stewart. I think whatever we can do as church in providing people with that voice and being attentive to that voice, that sense of empowerment, particularly coming through such suffering and such deprivation. And we're very grateful to the Mr. Sleemans of this world. As you may be aware, he stood up. He basically had to leave his job as a principal, and he never got a job again as a principal in the Catholic system. They said we've passed it on, and they kept constantly telling me that it's not concrete evidence. We need concrete evidence. I don't know how much more concrete evidence we could give them, Graham Sleeman said. The Commission received in evidence dozens of letters from the time Mr. Sleeman left the school from concerned parents and parishioners who wanted Father Searson out. As Sleeman said, I signed a contract to be a principal at that school, which said I would uphold the teachings of the Catholic Church and I'd provide a safe environment for children. And the diocese really did not assist me in providing a safe environment for any of these students in that school. He's always spoken very starkly, very simply. The principles are clear, why won't they apply? Coming here and knowing that you represent schools, not only from the Bridgerdean but from the presentation tradition, I was very taken with this interview with the actress Rachel Griffiths on the weekend, who of course attended Star of the Sea there in Victoria. Of course she has an uncle, a Jesuit too, but we won't hold that against her. Andy Hamilton. But this part of Rachel's interview I was quite taken with. Clearly the person interviewing her was not very enamoured of the Catholic Church and couldn't possibly believe that anyone of the intelligence and the achievement and the worldly presence of Rachel Griffiths would have any time for the church or for the education or the gifts that she'd received from the church. The mention of church is a reminder that Griffiths is a practising Catholic. I do go to Mass, she says, and that she was educated at Germaine Greer's old alma mater, Star of the Sea in Melbourne's Garden Vale. So she's asked, what were the nuns like? I loved my nuns. They were fierce and they were feminists. They were the masters of their domain. They were passionate about lifting girls out of poverty, about giving girls independence. They were funny, they were proud, they were rousing of our ambition. They gave you drive and the encouragement to make of your life what you wanted. Well, I think that's about as good a mission statement as you could hope for, isn't it? I remember a while ago, they were looking for a new Archbishop of Melbourne. I had a journalist from The Age ring me to say, your name keeps getting mentioned. I said, well, look, there are some pigs will fly also. And anyway, we had a long chat, and he said, look, would you be prepared to go on the record about some of this? I said, look, I'll say a couple of things, but not much. Anyway, we chatted away, and I said, well, look, 3 points. Whoever's going to be the new Archbishop of Melbourne is already a bishop, and I'm only a priest. Second, I've been a long time public advocate of women's ordination, so that means I'm out altogether. And thirdly, there's already a Pope named Francis who's there, who's a Jesuit. The prospect of a Jesuit being the Archbishop of Melbourne is just ludicrous. Anyway, he said to me, well look, when I write this up, do you want me to get back to you? I said, no, look, we're both busy people. You're a professional journalist. I said, just make sure that when you write it, that it comes over that I've been light-hearted and that not even my worst enemy could think, there he goes, ambitioning for that job. One of the reasons I think that women's ordination is just not going to go away, as I often say when I contemplate in my own family, like my mother, 90 today, a brilliant graduate of the Mercies, I have to confess. All my family went to Old Hallows in Brisbane, 4 generations of them. But for my mother, it was unimaginable, as I say, that the Prime Minister or the Governor-General or the Chief Justice would ever be a woman. For my sisters, who are professional women, I mean, my mother became a doctor, but then with 7 children, she didn't practice very much her medicine, except on 7 children. But my sisters, who are largely professionals, and for them, it did become imaginable. In fact, not only imaginable, they actually they've lived through the experience now, where there's been an Australian Prime Minister who was a woman, where there was a Governor-General who was a woman, and where the Chief Justice of the country is a woman. So I know for my nieces and grandnieces, this is not the stuff of dreams or imaginings, it's actual reality. And when you think back to what Rachel Griffiths says here, definitely in the past, the church was a privileged space where in some institutions the women ran the show and did it very ruggedly on their own and proudly on their own. And that means that the church, I think now, sociologically, is well behind the play, and it's one of the challenges which is going to remain with us. When Rachel Griffiths is asked about the sexual abuse crisis, she says, yes, I'm committed to the church, I got a lot of benefit out of my education from the nuns, none of which excuses any of the sexual abuse in the church. She says, I've been affected by the appalling abuses of the Catholic Church, mostly inflicted on boys, which I've had proximate experience of. I happen to have very different experience. Not that this in any way overrides the abuse of others. The Catholic Church represented brutal oppression, hypocrisy, and the devastation of a sense of self. So without feeling the need to justify why this leaves my faith intact, I think the church itself is something separate from my own connection with it and my own spiritual position. the messages that filtered through to me were of kindness, of compassion, of the gift of spiritual resistance to oppression. And I think particularly for those of you who are educators, and for those of you in your pastoral ministries, that's part the baggage, it's part the challenge that you carry as the church. That we are here to filter those messages of kindness, compassion, and I think that's a great phrase, the gift of spiritual resistance to oppression. Her own emphasis is hopeful, despite her admission of everything ghastly. Right now, she says, I find the Pope rather inspiring. I had the opportunity, I was in Rome in January last year, and I was asked by the then Australian ambassador, John McCarthy, would you like to meet the Pope? Now I know this will sound sacrilegious, but I'm one of those Jesuits who had prided myself that I had never met a Pope. And I was really quite content to go to my grave never having met a Pope. In fact, in 1986, I was the advisor to the Australian Catholic bishops on Aboriginal affairs. And you might remember John Paul II came to Australia and did a big tour. And he came to Alice Springs, where he had a big meeting with the Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders from all around Australia. And he turned up late, and there'd been a thunderstorm after very hot conditions there in Alice Springs. And when he finally landed, they brought him up what was called the Dreaming Track, and he gave his speech, and it was quite a rousing speech where he spoke about land rights and self-determination, as well as the spiritual place of Aborigines. Well, next morning, John Bathersby, who recently retired some time ago as Archbishop of Brisbane, said to me, do you want to hear a funny story? He said, when we got off the plane yesterday, Cardinal Clancy was introducing the Pope to the various bishops, and he came to Bishop Brennan from Wagga, and the Pope took Brennan by the hand and said, Brennan, the justice and peace man who has done so much for these people. This is the mission of the church. It must be encouraged. So as I'd always said since then, well, the Pope thought I was a bishop. The Pope thought he'd met me, but I'd never met him. So anyway, John McCarthy says, would you like to meet the Pope? I said, yeah, that'd be great. So he says, well, I'll get you a ticket and you'll get into a place where you'll meet the Pope. So we come along, and McCarthy, who's a pretty big, robust fellow, tried to get me into the very front section, past the gendarmerie, etc., but I could see that was not where I belonged at all, because everyone in the front section was a child dying of cancer, or someone in a wheelchair, or their carers. And so I went back and was put at the front of the second section, where I was with young married couples. And anyway, Pope Francis gave his speech, which I thought was a crashing ball, and then he was up on stage and received all of these Monsignori and bishops and archbishops and cardinals, and I thought, oh dear, this is the old Roman thing. It hasn't changed too much at all. So I was about to leave, but then Pope Francis came down, and he then spent the next 45 minutes greeting everybody in that front section. And it was then that I realised that this fella means what he says. That it's not about the words, it is about the relationships, particularly with those who are on the margins of life. So he then came to us. I was there, I came forearmed. I had a bottle of Inigo Jesuit 7 Hill wine from the Clare Valley, where of course the Austrian Jesuits had planted the vines many years ago. And I presented him with the bottle, saying Vino Jesuita Australiano, and he laughed and said, ah, aqua sacra, holy water. Now, you can see on the left of me there's a young couple who are wearing t-shirts. They were English. They hadn't realised that they were supposed to turn up in the attire in which they were married. So on the other side of me, for example, there was a couple from South America who were very well heeled and dressed to the absolute nines. So this couple went out and bought a couple of t-shirts, one black, one white, saying "just married." And they were able to enter into the spirit of the proceedings as well. As you know, one of his first pastoral visits outside of Rome was to Lampedusa, where he put himself on the line in terms of his commitment to those who are asylum seekers, where he put himself on the line with the moral questions about what it is for Western wealthy societies to maintain very strict border control policies. One of the things I like about this photo is he's there not only with, he's got bishops and monsignori around him in their attire down there on the wharf. There's also some of the asylum seekers, but also you'll see people from UNHCR and from the Red Cross. And for us as the contemporary church, I think we've emerged from that time where we draw some sort of dichotomy between the church and the world. And the church is the good, pure institution that has the vera doctrina. The world is the place which is full of mess and complexity. No, the NGOs that are there like UNHCR and the Red Cross, as you know, particularly with the young people you educate nowadays, that's the preferred locus for people to find a commitment in community to the dream of a better world, to the dream of what we would call God's grace breaking in and bringing the kingdom to bear here on earth. And so that image of him being there with UNHCR, with the Red Cross, and identifying with the refugees and the asylum seekers. As you heard, I had the privilege of heading an inquiry for the Rudd government on national human rights protections. When we first sat down to do that inquiry, I met with people from the Attorney General's Department, and they gave us a list of the places where we would hold our public consultations. And I said to them, but these are all Qantas destinations. They said yes, and I said, well, that's not a public consultation in Australia. Unless you get out into a four-wheel drive or into the occasional charter aircraft, you will not have engaged in a real public consultation of the Australian community. Well, we turned up here in Kalgoorlie for a community consultation and got word that there was a coronial inquest being held in the courtroom in relation to the death of a young Aboriginal man. You might remember the story. His name was Ward. He'd been picked up. He didn't really have much of a criminal history, but he'd been drinking one night, picked up, put in the pod of the paddy wagon. The air conditioning wasn't working. He was driven 200 or 300 kilometres. Basically, he was roasted to death. It was over 50 degrees inside that pod. So I said to the young lawyers from the Attorney General's Department, we'll just go down, we'll sneak into the back of the courtroom so we can just hear what's going on, because that'll be what's on everyone's minds when we sit down for the community consultation this afternoon. So along we went. Well, when you're my height, it's a bit hard just to sneak into the back of the courtroom. And as I was trying to do so, the fellow who's got a cap on, who's holding up the sign, White Australia Has a Black History, was quite some distance from his place of belonging. His name is Ben Taylor, and I'd known Ben for 20 years. He'd been involved in the Aboriginal Catholic ministry in Perth. So as I'm walking along, Ben calls out, hey, Father, over here, you've got to stand with us, Mom. Well, what do you think was my immediate reaction as Ben called this out, bearing in mind that the entire national media, including the Four Corners team, were there filming everything that was going on? My first thought was, I've got to keep myself outside of the frame. But then, when he said, you've got to stand here with us, Mom, I thought, well, really, there is no option but to stand, perhaps somewhat passively, but in solidarity with these people as they're protesting. One of the reasons I like this image is that you'll appreciate there would be no place for a white fella in that photo unless invited. I mean, imagine just going up, well, I'm here to stand in solidarity with you and your protest. well, thank you very much. You're part of the problem, not part of the solution. But to be invited in, then of course not to respond to the invitation, but to be there and knowing that no matter what your level of education or whatever, it's not your voice which is to be heard, and it's their voice which is to be heard, and that possibility of standing there in solidarity. In our Catholic tradition, the whole notion of interdependence, acknowledging in our head that interrelationship between our situation and that of those who are disadvantaged, and then moving from the head to the heart, that stand in solidarity, which is so essential. Where do we take the stand? I remember many years ago, a story I've often shared with educators, when I was up in far north Queensland at Kuranda one day, meeting with an Aboriginal group who were trying to get money and land so that they could settle. They'd been fringe dwellers. They were there by the edge of the Barron River. And we'd concluded the meeting. At the end of the meeting, an Aboriginal woman pointed across the river at a huge house. She said, "See that house? That's Mr. Armitage's weekender." Mr. Armitage was the chairman of the Victorian Racing Club. She said, "They don't come very often, but when they come in a helicopter. They've got a helipad there on the river," she said. A new word for the traditional owners of that part of the world. And she told me this story without any anger or resentment. It was just basically a statement of facts. I flew back to Melbourne and I went to Xavier College to give the last ever Year 12 religion class to the boys there. So I told this story almost without thinking. And then their questions started. And there were questions like, well, what's wrong with the businessman having a holiday house? Because clearly quite a few of them came from families with holiday houses. And if the businessman wasn't paying his taxes, you wouldn't be able to pay the welfare bill for the Aborigines anyway, so what's the big deal? And if the Aborigines want houses, why don't they build them for themselves? And as these questions came, I was there giving all of my flash Jesuit legal answers, but I could tell from the looks on faces, I wasn't convincing anybody. Until finally, in response, I said, look, I can't answer your questions, but I've got just one question for you in reply to your questions. Which side of the river are you standing on as you ask your questions? Now, there's never any doubt which side of the river they're standing on as they ask those questions. And can you see there are just as many questions you can ask from the other side of the river? Mind you, they're very different questions, and they're even more unanswerable. And for us, the challenge of being the contemporary church, I think, particularly with what Francis is putting before us, is that capacity to be at home and to move either side of the river. In fact, to have a preferential option which side of the river you're on, and it's the side of the river on which often we are not. And so that really is the outstanding challenge of the age for us as church. Just to open up briefly a couple of the themes which he emphasises in his great encyclical, Laudato Si. In the present condition of global society, where injustices abound and growing numbers of people are deprived of basic human rights and considered expendable, the principle of the common good immediately becomes logically and inevitably a summons to solidarity and a preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters. So in terms of answering those questions about what we're not doing, what the challenges are, what's the source of our hope, I would suggest to you that those notions of basic human rights, the common good, and the preferential option for the poor, all of them have to feature. And if they don't, then there's something missing. You may recognise that that's the first official portrait that was done of Francis. It was done by a Chinese-Australian artist. And I was at a meeting in the Vatican just recently And in the room where we had lunch, I looked up and there was the portrait, so that's the photo. In terms of what is the challenge put before us in Laudato Si, that there are three sets of relationships that we, our students, those we serve, need to get right. It's our relationship with the whole of creation, our relationship with the poor, and our own interior life, culminating in our relationship with God. If we approach nature and the environment without openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. And for you as educators, how do you provide that space for that sense of the openness to awe and wonder? The language not only of fraternity, but also the language of beauty. And how can we really incarnate this sense of intimate union with all that exists, so that sobriety and care will well up spontaneously? In order to be able to do this credibly, I think we need a better capacity as church to communicate our message to those who are not regular churchgoers, to those who don't sign up to the whole agenda given by the bishops or the Pope or whatever. And I think we've seen it very strongly in recent times in this country with the same-sex marriage debate. And as you would know, for young people, this issue has been something of a yawn. The morality of it to them is very self-evident. And it's very different from the mindset which informed a lot of the formal positions of our church. It's always seemed to me in the work that I've done in the public square that there are very different considerations that come to bear when you're asking about what should be the law or the social policy in a pluralistic democratic society over against what is the formal teaching of your church in relation to matters of morality, doctrine or sacraments. Now, as you may be aware, I got into a bit of trouble, still a bit of ongoing trouble actually, for as a priest saying yes, I would be voting yes, and these are the reasons I will be voting yes. I remember during the plebiscite campaign meeting with one of our key bishops, and I said to him, look, the yes vote in this is going to come in somewhere between 57 and 63%. He said, well, how can you say that? I said, well, the polling shows that, and clearly that's what it'll be. Well, it came in at 62%. I said, now, given that it's going to be that strongly for a yes vote, and given it's going to be legislated, I said, it seems to me that the goods that are to be achieved are in terms of the pastoral care and solicitude of everyone involved in this debate, particularly the increasing number of children who are being brought up in same-sex relationships. Also, I think there are questions about freedom of religion, but they're complex legal political questions which go to the lack of a Human Rights Act at the Australian federal level. And the third issue is that of maintaining the stand of the church. Now, I said, people like yourself think that it can be done by being out there saying vote no. I actually think that's counterproductive. And I think in terms of what are the goods that we are seeking to achieve, it's quite responsible for someone like myself to be expressing that view. Well, you might have seen the recent cartoon in the Australian, which I must say I quite enjoyed. I think we've got to get used to the idea that there will be differences of opinion. In fact, I was being asked about this on Sky News yesterday. It was mainly a discussion about poor old Archbishop Wilson, but then Sky News had broken the story a couple of weeks ago they finally discovered that, yes, in February I'd been banned from coming into a diocese because of my errant views on this topic. And I was asked, how is the situation now? I said, well, as I understand it, I'll be back in that diocese in the near future doing my day job, which is CEO of Catholic Social Services. I said, but I think we need to get to the stage, as I have said to some of our bishops, look, there are a lot of Catholics who don't like your view of the world, and there are a lot of Catholics who don't like my view of the world. But the Church is big enough to accommodate both groups. That being the case, we need to be able to work together. And we've got to be able to do that respectfully, with the expression and the understanding of that difference of perspectives. And I think that's one of the challenges for us, particularly with the young generation, whereas you would appreciate notions of tradition, authority, long-term commitment, community, which is imposed. Those sorts of ideas have no currency with them. And so to be able to relate meaningfully with them, then it's necessary for those divergences of opinion to be respectfully held together. During the campaign, I had one bishop write to me saying that he had an anonymous complaint from someone who said, well, how dare Father Brennan say these sorts of things? I said, well, look, we can all share anonymous anecdotes. I said, I'll share another one with you. I said, I was giving a talk in Melbourne last night, and an 80-year-old woman approached me at the end of the night. I know not who she is, but she came, she took me by the arm and she said, Father Brennan, I am one of those Catholics who's hanging on just by a thread, and you are that thread. Now, I don't think we can just cut them adrift. These are people who think seriously about their faith, and they think seriously about the social issues which are confronted.